Hello, everyone. This session is on Symfony2 and Drupal 8. A bit about me, this distorted picture. My name is Larry Garfield, or online I go by Krell. I'm a senior architect at Palantir.net. We're a Drupal development shop based in Chicago. I'm an advisor to the Drupal Association, which is kind of the support organization for the Drupal project. For Drupal 7, I'm one of the core initiative owners for web services. More about that in a little bit. Authored one of the leading books on Drupal 7. And I talk about architecture, software architecture, and shoot my colleagues with Nerf guns. So that's about all you need to know about me. What we're actually talking about here today, though, is Drupal. Who here has heard of Drupal? That's what I thought. Who here has used Drupal? Who here uses Drupal regularly? Okay, good. It's a much better audience than I had in Paris. Who here considers themselves primarily a Drupal developer? I know there's a couple of you here. Okay. Drupal represent. So, Drupal. Probably know much of this. Drupal is huge. Drupal runs roughly 1 in 50 websites in the world. That's a ton. Whitehouse.gov, Examiner.com, several public radio stations, a few zillion blogs. Drupal is powering the internet at this point. Drupal has somewhere north of 11,000 modules available for it. Drupal modules being the equivalent of bundles, essentially, extensions. And I believe there's somewhere around 20,000 people who have some kind of commit access to Drupal.org's Git repositories. This is DrupalCon Denver earlier this year. So how many people do we have at this conference, roughly? Looks like 200-300? 3,000 at our major developer conference. Drupal 7, current stable version, had somewhere around 1,000 individual contributors. Drupal 8, our next version, currently is sitting around 600 and climbing steadily. Like any project, there's a long tail of lots of people who do a lot of work and a lot of people who do a patch here and there. But over 1,000 people, I would say Drupal has one of the densest developers to lines of code of any major open source project. There are roughly 20,000 new Drupal 7 sites that come online every month. This is an enormous growth. Drupal 7 surpassed the previous version, Drupal 6, in less than a year and is still climbing. And it's probably not going to start declining until Drupal 8 comes out. This is big. I'll be honest about it. Drupal is awesome. Drupal is a big fish. And building off of this success, what does Drupal want to do? What does the Drupal community want to do? We want to keep growing. We want to seriously kick ass with our next version, Drupal 8, which is due out in somewhere around a year. Just one small problem that restricts our ability to do that. A lot of Drupal clients don't realize this little dirty secret of Drupal, that this is where Drupal comes from. Drupal began as it wasn't a big professional project. It wasn't built on good practices from the get-go. It started off as some college kid named Dries Boytaert setting up a messaging board for his friends in college so that they could communicate without having to all get separate, very expensive broadband connections, because broadband in Belgium was very, very expensive. And it was released as open source, and like good open source projects, grew from there, built a community around it, evolved a great deal, added functionality, added flexibility. But fundamentally, Drupal is an 11-year-old PHP 4-based /dot clone originally written by a Belgian college kid. And the fact that major enterprises, Sony BMG, Warner Brothers, build their entire web presence around this kind of system is both insanely cool and insanely terrifying. I say this as one of the lead developers for Drupal. This is scary and scary. Drupal was originally built as a system to deliver an HTML page to a desktop browser. Fine. In 2000, 2001, that's pretty much all you ever did, was deliver a web page to a desktop browser. Maybe a laptop if you were really cutting edge. Nowadays, that's not the case anymore. By our estimates, Drupal is 2% of the web. That's only a tiny fraction of all CMS-based sites in the world. What is only a tiny fraction of the websites on the internet. And within a couple of years, mobile is going to take over everything. The number of years depends on which analyst you ask, but there are already sites, especially news sites, that are reporting 20, 30, 40% of their traffic is coming from mobile devices, not desktops, not laptops. Even without that, a lot of sites are being driven now by edge site includes and varnish and other advanced technologies like that. So what it means to deliver things on the web is changing. This is where, if Drupal wants to continue to be a market leader, it needs to end up. We'll be serving content to desktop browsers, but also content to kiosk applications, to mobile browsers, to dedicated applications on multiple platforms, delivering content to other Drupal sites directly over web services, delivering content to completely foreign systems built on Symfony or on Java or on Ruby on Rails or whatever over web services, even delivering to, maybe not Flash. And this is something that, honestly, right now Drupal can do, just very hackily. It's not really what it's designed to do. But that's OK, because we're up to the challenge of fixing it. Because, let's move forward. And that brings us to the Web Services and Context Core Initiative. It's an initiative for Drupal 8 that I'm leading, the basic idea of which comes down to evolving Drupal from a first-class web CMS into a first-class REST server. Because really, everything on the web is REST. Web pages are just a special case of REST. Everyone know what REST is when I talk about REST? OK? Yeah. REST, web services are things delivered over HTTP that are not HTML. Really, HTML is just another case of that. So this is what we need to do. And actually, this isn't even what we started out to do. This is the way we get to what we really wanted to do, which was to change just our page layout system. In Drupal 7, those of you who have been around since Symfony 1 may recognize some of these. In Drupal 7, and earlier, our basic workflow is request comes in, we build this kind of central content area, and then decorate it with stuff around the outside, and there's your page. And that's all well and good for your traditional blog roll type site, but that's not the case for a large percentage of the internet. Instead, we wanted to end up here, where we have a request come in, and then we build the page outline, and then components within that page. And each of those components can be composed of other components. This top-down approach gives us more flexibility, gives us the ability to cache each of these separate components, we call them blocks, independently of each other, render them independently with edge site includes, all of the things you need to do to build a modern, high-performance, high-traffic website. And in order to do that, it makes sense to, once you've built that system, just makes sense to build web services into that, because those are web services. Each one of these blocks is a web service call. Does this sound familiar to anyone who's worked with Symfony2? Okay, why am I talking about this at a Symfony conference? Well, summer of last year, summer of 2011, we were trying to figure out, okay, how can we make this transition? How can we turn Drupal inside out to continue to be a market-leading product? And we said, okay, one of the things we need is a good, solid request-response library, just abstracting HTTP. Why in the world should we write one? Let's go find one ready-made, open source for the win. And so we looked at a couple, in particular Symfony2 and Zend. And we liked both of them. Both of them had a lot of things going for them. And in the end, we decided to go with Symfony2's HTTP Foundation component. Just that. Why? Well, three main reasons. One, at the time, Zend had a contributor license agreement, and That turned me off because I wanted us to be able to work upstream. I wanted Drupal to be able to work with whatever platform we started pulling pieces in from. 2, okay, Symfony's was a bit nicer. They're both fairly equivalent in terms of functionality. We kind of preferred the structure for Symfony, but it wasn't a huge deal. The big selling point, though, for why Symfony over Zend is we had 2 leading Symfony developers coming into our issue queues, into our discussions, and offering to help, offering advice, offering feedback without us even asking. One of them was Fabien, and the other is Lucas Smith. So if you're wondering what I'm doing here talking, well, really, it's all his fault. And so we said, OK, let's work on this, start building the tools we need on top of HTTP Foundation. And as you can imagine, it's not a simple task. So we're going along and running into a lot of roadblocks, a lot of walls, a lot of, oh, wait, this doesn't work as we thought. And a lot of people just weren't quite getting the massive rewrite we were going for. And so I was hanging around the Symfony channel one night, Symfony IRC channel, and asked about this HTTP kernel thing that Lucas had been talking about. And a very nice Symfony developer spent the next 4 hours, even though it was after midnight for him in Paris, explaining to me how HTTP kernel works. And I realized, OK, so everything we're talking about doing, you already did. All right, you win. Open source, yay. So really, it's all his fault. Stoff, for those who haven't met him yet. So it took a while, but as a community, we decided, you know what? This is the right way forward. And the way to turn Drupal into that first-class REST server and first-class CMS of tomorrow is to say, Symfony's taking care of a lot of this for us. Let's just use it. So this is where we're headed with Drupal version 8. Have many of the Symfony components, not the full stack framework, just the components, at the core. Foundation, kernel, dependency injection, and so forth. Bring in many of the same partner libraries. We're currently exploring Twig. We have pieces of Doctrine we've pulled in. And then our own newly refactored components. On top of that, we can build the libraries that make Drupal Drupal. And then we have our Drupal modules that ship with the core system, extensions. The same kind of model we've got now, but much better factored and built on a solid foundation from Symfony. So I'm going to talk a bit about kind of what we've done and what we're planning to do, with the caveat of this is still very much under construction. We're still in active development, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But this is the kind of hybrid that you should expect out of Drupal 8. So this is where we started. We need to evolve from a first-class CMS to a first-class REST server that includes a CMS. Hey, look, a first-class REST server. It's called Symfony. Well, that was easy. So what are we doing? Start with the kernel. You're all familiar with the HTTP kernel class, HTTP Foundation, that whole workflow. We've adopted it wholesale. It's already in Foundation library, kernel, routing, event dispatcher. All those tools are in place and running Drupal 8 today. As we're building stuff around that, we're trying to steer as close as possible to the way the Symfony components are designed, the way the Symfony components are designed to work with each other. Because why reinvent the wheel? These components are already there. This architecture is already there. And we're also pulling in some pieces from full stack, mostly out of Framework Bundle. So, for example, the extended HTTP kernel that Framework Bundle provides, we're using that at the moment because that's where all of the fun sub-request handling happens. We're planning to pull in the auto-loading of arguments for the controller, other things like that. At the moment, we don't have the full Framework Bundle pulled in. We may. That's still up in the air. As an example, in Drupal 7, if you crack it open, this is our main index.php file. So we start by, get over here. You just set up our root environment, load up all of our code, Drupal 7 being mostly a procedural framework, and do all of our initialization, and then menu execute active handler. And that takes care of the entire request handling. Okay, so that's 7. What does it look like in 8? This may look more familiar. So we've still got some legacy procedural code we haven't gotten rid of yet. So we have to load that up. And then all we do is bring up the code itself. Okay, and mostly that's just include legacy garbage. And then start up a kernel. This is a subclass of the kernel class in HTTP kernel. I'll be familiar with that. Create a request, and then fire it through the normal Symfony process. That's it. If you've been working with Symfony2 for a while, this should be very familiar. That's our goal. Drupal should be familiar to experienced Symfony developers. And incidentally, this prepare, Fabien in his Paris keynote, when he was talking about this, said this is a bug. It's not a bug. We actually put that capability in to chain prepare. For routing, Drupal, every time I say this to major Symfony developers, they freak out. A typical Drupal site has over 1,000 routes in it. Anyone want to gasp? Okay. Most of them are part of the administrative UI because Drupal puts most of its emphasis on enabling people in the UI, in the interface, to reconfigure their site rather than having to go edit config files for everything. And so it means we have a lot of routes. And doing one big route collection that we analyze at runtime then becomes prohibitive. That's fine. We can still use the routing component and just make our own matcher. This matcher, we're calling nested matcher for the time being. Hopefully this should get committed like next week. It's database backed. So we take all of our routes and dump them using the matcher dumper interface to our database. But that's configurable. You can swap out something else for it. And then we can match against that with a multi-stage matcher. So it's essentially a filter. Who's used the dynamic router out of Symfony CMF? Anyone familiar with that yet? One person? 2 people? A couple? Okay. It's kind of a more advanced version of that, which is actually in large part inspired by CMF's router. But lets us do configurable routing based on path, based on MIME type, based on method, based on type of object, if we are so inclined. So different data objects on the same path could end up at different places, different controllers. All of it's injected, configurable through the Symfony dependency injection container, which we've also brought in. I mentioned MIME type. We are working to support MIME type-based matching in this. That's one of our goals to be able to route 2 requests to the same object with different MIME types to 2 different controllers, which is what you want to do for true REST. If you have a request come in for some data object, some node with type text HTML, you'd return an HTML page. If it's type JSON, you return a JSON string. If it's type PDF, you render it to a PDF. That's what we want to be able to do out of the box. We've started work on a standalone content negotiation library because MIME type negotiation is actually really, really complicated, in part because the rules for it are very ill-defined. And we're trying to do this as a freestanding non-Drupal library so that this can be shared by Drupal and other projects. At the moment, it's still, we're trying to get people to work on that. It's not an area that a lot of people have expertise in. So that's likely to happen post feature freeze, and so that'll be an aftermarket add-on. But we want that to work. If that's something you're interested in, talk to me. Let's try and get this library going. And most of this, we're planning to push back upstream to Symfony CMF. I've talked with David Buckman, who's the routing lead for Symfony CMF, and he's very excited about the stuff we're doing. And once this settles down a bit, we'll be pushing that upstream to Symfony CMF. What does that mean? It means Drupal, Symfony CMF, and Easy Publish will all end up using the same routing logic, the same routing system. 2 years ago, that would be unheard of for 3 projects of that size to be collaborating like that. But that is happening these days. Dependency injection. You're all familiar with that in Symfony, I would hope. It's not something Drupal has traditionally used. It's just, again, procedural heritage. And so we do have a lot of global dependencies right now. And we're trying to eliminate them as quickly as we can and move them into the Symfony injection container. So at Fabien's suggestion, we're starting off by just centralizing all of that stuff in the injection container. It's not fully factored out yet. But once we have them pulled out that way, then we can refactor them and make them truly injected, once we have the instantiation handled that way. So for right now, we have something that's a little bit older. It's evolved a bit since then. Utility that creates a Symfony injection container that we can then pull from anywhere globally. And as we migrate stuff into it, like our language handling system and so forth, then we can refactor that to be fully injected. So we're using this kind of as a wedge to evolve our entire code base, not just the Symfony parts, but as a way to leverage these good best practices that Symfony uses across the entire Drupal code base. And eventually I want this function to go away. It may not in Drupal 8. I'm hoping by Drupal 9 we can eliminate this thing entirely. Event dispatcher. Drupal has an event system, actually. It's called hooks. Who's worked with hooks in Drupal? This half of the room has? OK. So hooks are Drupal's event system, essentially. They are procedural. It's very similar to event dispatcher, except that instead of an explicit registration, we just use function exists. It's magically named functions based on modules. And that lets us do a very cheap, very simple, procedural aspect-oriented programming. And this has been a huge source of power for Drupal for a long time. It is actually faster than the event dispatcher component because there's fewer moving parts, and there's no need to compile anything, which means it makes development easier. On the other hand, it means function exists, we're dealing with functions, makes it a lot harder to lazy load code. We have some ways of doing it, but it's kind of gross. It's extremely hard to unit test properly because, well, it's global state, and global state you cannot unit test. And just the way it's implemented, each module in Drupal can only implement one of each hook. So it can only respond to each event once. This is kind of example of what that looks like. So we have some module underscore name of hook. And then when you call module invoke all, that hook gets fired, and you get back an array of all the results. Very, very similar to event dispatcher conceptually. It differs mostly just in implementation details. For Drupal 8, we have adopted event dispatcher for things that touch the kernel. And actually, some of our other systems are starting to use it. It's not going to completely replace hooks, in part just for time reasons, in part for performance reasons. So I expect Drupal 8 will ship with both Symfony events and old-style hooks in place. Kind of the closer you get to the core routing path, the more likely it's going to be using event dispatcher, simply because that's the part we're replacing with Symfony. There's work happening to somewhat refactor the hook engine to make it a bit cleaner as a stopgap. So that should help some. But long-term, I would not be surprised to see hooks go away. I know the Drupal people in the room are freaking out when I say this. I would not be surprised to see hooks go away eventually and get replaced with the event dispatcher from Symfony. Twig. Once we started looking at Symfony for routing, there's plenty more that Symfony has to offer. Okay, Twig is not part of Symfony proper, but it's still a very good library. Symfony people are familiar with it. And we showed that to a lot of our front-end developers, and they went, ooh. So Drupal 7 uses your traditional PHP as template language. And there's a kind of a long pipeline for that. So very powerful pre-process mechanism for templates. And it works as of Drupal 7 on the idea of building up things to get turned into HTML as nested arrays, kind of an abstract syntax tree, that lets you modify that and modify your output anytime up until the very last second that things get rendered down into a final page. on the upside, it's actually an extremely flexible way of doing things. We can do things in Drupal with this model by adding modules next to each other without making someone edit their markup. So you don't have to go through and edit every template to add some new capability. It means we don't need to have a compile step, which eases development. One of the benefits of using PHP as your templating language is that it's an opportunity for front-end developers to on-ramp themselves, learn a little bit of programming, a little bit of PHP, and then work up from there and eventually become major core developers. And that has happened. And let's face it, all template languages eventually evolve to become Turing complete. This is actually a quote from a developer/attorney who works for the Software Freedom Law Center, James Vazil. But he's right. On the downside, though, gigantic arrays are not exactly well documented. It's kind of hard to document gigantic nested arrays. And all this flexibility means that at times the theme system can be a bit unpredictable, especially if you're not used to how it is expected to work. And yeah, you have to learn PHP, and sometimes not a trivial amount of PHP, in order to do the really advanced stuff. And we know this is a problem. And somewhere around DrupalCon Denver in March of this year, some of our lead developers got together and said, you know what? This is nuts. This is not a good set of trade-offs. Let's get rid of these arrays of doom. Background, Caroline Negisi is one of the people responsible for Drupal's heavy emphasis on arrays. So for him to turn around and say this is huge. So is Twig going to be in Drupal 8? I hope so. There's people working on it. Why? Well, probably reasons you're familiar with if you use Twig. More secure, more front-end developer friendly. As I said, all of the front-end developers that we've shown Twig to say, would you be happier with this than with the current template system, have gone, yes, please! So we're working at it. Potentially, the ability to do client-side rendering with Twig.js. And it's one less thing that is Drupal specific. It's one more thing that people outside the Drupal world will have experience with. That makes it easier for people to develop on Drupal. On the other hand, this is a really hard thing to do because the mental models of our template system and Twig are very, very different. The way you approach structuring your page and structuring your templates is very different. And I should have taken that out. We figured out how to secure those compiled templates. This is an area that we could definitely use help. So if you're able to help, if you know a fair bit about Twig and want to see it running 2% of the web, let me know. Overall, there's been a strong push in Drupal as part of this adoption of Symfony to replace the not invented here problem that pretty much every PHP project before 2010 had with proudly invented elsewhere. Replacing Drupal code with some existing standard, good, well-factored modern library is something that we've been pushing for more as a result. So our new configuration system is built on YAML now. It's using the Symfony YAML component rather than some proprietary format. We've pulled in the Doctrines Common Annotations library. So we're not using the full Doctrine suite, just the annotations. But that's something where we already pushed some new development upstream to help improve the parser for that. That made it possible for us to leverage for our new plugin system. We've started using Composer, not entirely, but we're using Composer to pull in the third-party libraries that we're using. And there's a number of people, myself included, pushing for us to adopt that as a way to track Drupal modules. So rather than using our own system for identifying modules and downloading them with our own build system, switch over to Composer for that, which means, I don't know, somewhere around doubling the number of components available through Composer. Okay, half of those will be Drupal specific, but it's still a ton more code available through that mechanism, because Composer is just a really, really nice library, really good way of handling dependencies. We're in the process of evaluating Aesthetic for handling CSS and JavaScript aggregation. We're still not sold on it, but we are giving it a serious look to see how much will it do for us. There's discussion of Guzzle for outbound HTTP requests, And we're actually talking to the lead developer of Guzzle about how could he refactor it so we could pull in pieces of Guzzle as needed. And he's been very cooperative working with us on that as well. So hopefully Guzzle will get improved by the process of Drupal trying to adopt it. There's a little bit of talk about the Imagine library for doing image handling. That one may not happen just for time reasons. No, we don't have a lot of people paying attention to that one, but that discussion has been opened. We're also refactoring our own system as well. We have a huge number of utility libraries, essentially, in Drupal that are somewhat older, procedurally based. But as of Drupal 8, we have adopted PSR 0 for all of our classes. And we're starting to move our existing code base over to that. So we have a getText wrapping library for doing translation using the translation standard for getText, PO files. This is a big one. I mentioned earlier compiling twig files. One of the selling points of Drupal is how much you can do through the web UI rather than having to drop down to the command line. Now with Symfony, you assume that you have a command line. You go down to the command line, run compile, your injection container gets rebuilt, your twig templates get rebuilt, fine. It's not really so easy if you're running from a web interface and something in the web interface triggers that rebuild, because then you have Apache writing PHP code that it's then going to run, which should be throwing big, huge red security flags in your mind. We figured out a way to secure that code. So we can now write compile twig templates and the injection container to disk as PHP fast and securely. That's huge. That's something that we've done in order to further leverage the Symfony tools. An archiver system. We have a graph matching system. This one, if we end up switching to Composer, may get deprecated. I'm not sure that's for handling dependencies between Drupal modules. We have a new plugin system that we built that's based on something like 6 years worth of experience in Drupal's contributed module space. That's extremely powerful. I'd say that this is more flexible in terms of just assembly of logic and assembly of configuration than anything I've seen in Symfony either. But it, again, pulls in a lot of the same good practices that Symfony does. Some improved reflection libraries, more to come. Pulling Symfony in has really started a wave throughout Drupal development of modernization and best practices that I'm really, really happy to see, to really see happen. But that's that. We're not just pulling code in and rewriting things. We want to be working with Symfony, with other projects. And that's started. We want to be doing more of it. Now, there's one caveat. Symfony2 is MIT licensed. Drupal is GPL licensed. Neither of these is going to change anytime soon, which means that the code itself can only flow the one direction for the most part. But that's OK. We're fine with working upstream. There's still some coordination details to work out, like how we handle security releases. That's in progress. I think there is some discussion going on there. But you may or may not have seen Symfony improvements coming from Drupal developers. For example, Symfony2's flash message system. You've probably all used that at some point. Yeah. It was just too simple for us to be able to use. We already had a similar system that had a lot more capability called Drupal set message. But we still wanted to be able to leverage the full Symfony session handling system. So great, let's make less code in the world. We helped design a new way of handling flash messages. And then a developer named Drak from Zakula CMS, which is also using Symfony, went ahead and implemented that. If you're using Symfony 2.1, you have that new flash message system. And there's an open issue now to swap out our session handling system with the new Symfony one. File streaming. Symfony 2.0 introduced stream response. And that's all well and good, but Drupal does an awful lot of serving up files off disk through PHP, through for security reasons and such, private file handling. And do we use read file for that? fopen? Please don't. fpass-through, if you're on Nginx, you can use xn file. This really should be encapsulated. And we talked to Fabien. He said this should just be in Foundation. Send me a pull request. So we did. And I'm not quite sure what its status is. At the moment, I think it's just sitting waiting for Fabien to get back to it after the feature freeze for 2.1. Expect this in 2.2, where you can just fire up a response object, give it the name of a file, and it'll stream it using the fastest method available. That issues a Drupal developer pushing that. A couple of others I mentioned before. Prepare on the response class is now chainable. Great. Flatten exception is now a almost complete drop-in replacement for an actual exception object out of PHP. Makes it easier to switch back and forth. We fixed some edge case encoding weirdness that we had a solution for already. Symfony didn't take care of, so we just fixed it. Big change here. The default router in Symfony is based around URL matcher and request context. OK, that's great for decoupling it from HTTP Foundation, but we need to be able to match on the full request object, including attributes. OK, we are in the process of pushing that kind of flexibility upstream. Matcher now, there's not just URL matcher, there's also a request matcher interface you may have seen in 2.1. That's something that was pushed by Drupal developers, and we're still working to get that fully fleshed out for generator as well. The goal being, do routing based on the complete request object, all the information available to you. Couple of API improvements, more stability for the route serialization, some improvements to the store object for HTTP cache. There are a lot of issues where we're saying this really should be fixed upstream. Let's go do that. So now, great, this is great, this is wonderful, Drupal 8 sounds cool, but why would you be using Drupal instead of just Symfony? You already know Symfony. If Drupal is just extended Symfony, why bother? Well, Symfony is a framework. It is a very good framework, but it's a framework. Drupal is not a framework. At the same time, Drupal is not really a CMS either. Or I should say it's not just a CMS. Drupal is a complete platform for assembling your own CMS or your own application, mostly through the UI rather than developing new code. This vastly lowers the barrier to entry for people to build cool things with Drupal. And as of Drupal 8, it'll be a Symfony-based platform. We like Symfony. We are adopting Symfony because it's tools that let you build your own framework. And it is very good at that, and we're trying to do that as much as possible. Our hope is that as Symfony developers, you'll like Drupal 8 because it's a full platform that lets you build your own application faster and with more flexibility than coding it on top of Symfony yourself. For instance, Drupal's data system, or entity system, is based on entity objects which have fields on them. And all of that is configurable via the UI. You can build your entire data model for a site or an application by pushing buttons in the UI, complete with forms, storage, validation, display, everything, just by pushing buttons. Take 2 hours to plan something out carefully, take an hour of pushing buttons, and you're done. And I'm not exaggerating. The rules module. Okay, some would argue that this is over-engineering, but for a lot of cases, if I can just push a couple of buttons and set up auto messages and auto notification to go out on certain times for certain actions, great. I don't need to write code. I don't need to pay someone to write code. I can just configure what my business logic could be. I can configure my business rules straight through the UI. And as of Drupal 8, push that down to code as well and check it into Git. Views. This is one of the systems that really put Drupal on the map. It's a list builder, but more it's a query builder. So once you have your data model configured via the UI, you can then go in and build whatever displays you need, whatever queries you need, whatever views into your data you need. You want to build a blog? You never actually touch code for that. You want to build a slideshow? You never actually touch code for that. You can just push buttons and build up 80% of your site in a day or two. Lets you click together your entire site. Okay, major sites sometimes still need glue code. That's something I don't expect to ever change. But you can get more done without having to resort to new development. There are a lot of distributions built on top of Drupal. Distributions are applications. Essentially, they're an application built using Drupal as a platform, as a framework. OpenAtrium was one of the first. It's a project management tool, kind of like Basecamp or Redmine, built on top of Drupal. Drupal Commerce is a full e-commerce tool chain built on top of Drupal. It has a quick starter, so if you want to put together a basic web store, you download the Drupal Commerce Kickstarter, start entering products, and good to go. Or assemble your own set of e-commerce needs as part of a larger site by just installing the necessary modules. OpenPublish is a news aggregator and syndication system built on Drupal. Drupal Commons, corporate intranet in a box, built on Drupal. But wait, there's more. This is not all we're doing in Drupal 8. It's not just pulling in Symfony components. So those of you who have worked with Drupal before know that deployment can sometimes be a problem. I'm seeing a couple people grin at that. Yeah. The Configuration Management Initiative, pushing all of our configuration down to YAML files, backed by Symfony's YAML component, which means you save the change, it goes down to YAML immediately, securely, check it into Git, push it out, do whatever. The staging problem for configuration, solved. Mobile-friendly administration. There's work going on to make it possible to handle most of, maybe not all, most of Drupal's administration from a mobile device, from a phone. Pick up your phone, post a new blog entry, filter out spam comments, whatever you need to do from a mobile interface. Multilingual support, already one of Drupal's strongest selling points. It's getting even better because it's getting easier for developers to leverage without having to think about it in every case. Most of Drupal is now converted over to be HTML5 based from the get-go. All of our core themes, all of our core templates, HTML5 through and through. We have jettisoned support for IE6, IE7, IE8 is only half supported. So, as a Drupal front-end developer, you don't need to worry about those anymore. All of our core themes are going responsive. The goal being it should be easier to make a responsive theme in Drupal 8 than it is to make a non-responsive theme. That's our goal. The entity system, as I mentioned, is getting a huge cleanup that makes it easier to syndicate, easier to save, easier to serialize, easier to send through web services. As I mentioned, a block-driven layout that is really built around ESI, which is really easy to do when you've got HTTP kernel, sub-requests, and HTTP cache. This is what lets us build this kind of really powerful layout tool. And again, most of this, our goal is to be configurable through the UI. As of last report, we had somewhere over 1,500 issues closed and counting, and we're not even at feature freeze yet. If you want to have a look at what Drupal 8 is shaping up to be, we have our own Git repository for that. Download it, play around with it, give us feedback, get involved. But this is a lot of work to retrofit a system of this size, and it's moving along, but we do need help with that, especially people who are familiar with Symfony, who are familiar with a lot of the tools, especially like in the Bootstrap we're still working on. If this is interesting to you, if you'd like to see, the world's leading PHP CMS become fully Symphonyified, is that a word? Symphonyified? Symphonized? Whatever. We are actively looking for help in that. We are well aware that most Drupal developers are still Symfony newbies, and we need people to help guide us in a lot of areas. Our feature freeze is coming up December 1st, code freeze April 1st. We're looking at a release hopefully somewhere around August of next year. Hop into IRC, hop into the issue queues, come talk to me. I'm still here for the rest of the conference. And let's figure out where we can work together. let's all have a nice big Drupal group hug at Bad Camp, Bay Area Drupal Camp, coming up in just over a month. It is one of the largest Drupal camps. It's a free camp happening just across the bay. Last year, we had 1,500 people. Probably going to be around the same this year. And that's free trainings, free sessions, free development areas. I encourage you all to join us there. And let's continue this development and make Drupal really the leading Symfony-based product out there. The Web Services Initiative is where you can get more information about kind of our architectural plans. Rate the session, stalk me on Twitter. Any questions? Okay. So the question for the recording is, this sounds awesome, but what about people used to the Drupal 7 model? And what I've actually found is that, well, first of all, Drupal, we do break APIs between every major version. That's just part of our development philosophy. Is we would rather be as good as possible than backward compatible. Perfectly good reasons to make that argument either way. This is the way we've usually gone. So, Drupal developers are used to the fact that they have to do non-trivial work to update modules between versions, and yet we still have thousands available for Drupal 7. But when I'm at Drupal conferences and I talk about this stuff, and the fact that so much more is going to be object-oriented, so much more is going to be dependency injection-based, the response I get is usually, finally, not, oh my god. There are some oh my gods, but much more of it is finally. So that's a concern. But I think in practice, the benefits will be worth it for most people, especially people who are not already hardcore Drupal developers. People who are working on pretty much any other system out there are used to an object-oriented approach. Anyone coming out of college in a CS program is used to an object-oriented approach. Our expectation is that the learning curve for Drupal development on Drupal 8 for a new developer should be much lower than it is for Drupal 7. And our current developers are either used to the transition or looking forward to the transition. So, yes, it's a concern, but I don't think it's going to be a terminal one. Other questions? So, question again for the recording. Does this transition mean anything for our support strategy for old versions? We haven't discussed that changing. We're still looking at current version and one version back. So, Drupal 6 will end support, expectation roughly around summer of next year when Drupal 8 ships. There's a big discussion when Drupal 7 came out about what to do about Drupal 5, and honestly, the answer was very similar to what Fabien said about Symfony LTS releases this morning, which is, if you're interested, the community won't be doing it, but if there's a market there, people will do it. And no one is actually doing that for Drupal 5. I'd be very surprised if people started doing that for Drupal 6, but if so, great, there's a market there. But at this point, we don't have any particular plans to change that approach. Other questions? Yeah. So modules versus bundles. At the moment, the way bundles in Symfony register is different enough from the way modules register that Symfony bundles are not going to work directly, in large part because they're not using the Symfony config component, or we're not using the Symfony configuration component. However, we are using the bundles system out of HTTP kernel to support service container registration. So Drupal modules will have a bundle class in them, much the same way that Symfony bundles do, but I don't expect them to be interchangeable with Symfony bundles. Whether or not that ends up changing at some future version past Drupal 8, I have no idea. I'm not thinking that far ahead. But at the moment, we're not looking at that. It'd be kind of cool if that were possible, but I don't think that's possible short term. Authentication and security, not looking at those at the moment. We have a fairly solid access control system in Drupal as is, and while we're working to clean it up somewhat, I don't think we're looking at radical changes there. Also, our general consensus is the Symfony security component is a really big and complicated beast, and we don't have time this version to figure out how and if to integrate that. I would not be surprised if that question comes up for Drupal 9. What will happen then, I don't know. Same thing for forms, actually. We've talked to Bernhard about the Symfony forms component, and it looks promising. Not going to happen for Drupal 8. I give it 50-50 odds for Drupal 9. So a lot of this is long game, but we're all in this regard. Other questions? Yeah. Questions about compiling code in a development environment. There is the talk of having a dev versus prod toggle in Drupal. At the moment, we don't, at least not at a global level. There are a couple of systems that have their own. I'd like to see something like that happen, but again, that needs someone behind it who can champion that and figure out how can we leverage that best. So if you're interested in that, let me know. We can put you in the right place for it, because I would like to see that happen. Config and translation. I've not looked into config in detail. We already had a new configuration system very far along by the time we decided to adopt Symfony, so that question never really came up. In large part, we have a lot more configuration, I think, and it has to be UI-driven. That may get asked in Drupal 9, but not for Drupal 8. For translation, I'm the wrong person to ask. I barely understand how translation works in the first place. I do know that we talked at one point about pushing some of our translation logic upstream to Symfony because it is very, very robust, and we couldn't for licensing reasons because ours is all GPL from a dozen different people, some of whom we can't find anymore. So same problem that Linux has. So yeah, I don't know enough about those areas to really speak to them. Other questions? So question again for the recording is, do we see Drupal modules going the way Symfony bundles have, where the real logic gets pushed out to a component that's just a freestanding library and then glue code? I dearly hope so. I've been trying to push for that. That's why when we were setting up, okay, how are we going to leverage PSR 0, I pushed for us to have a separate components area exactly for that reason, to help push that kind of mindset. The degree to which that's going to happen in Drupal modules in general, I don't know yet. In large part, I think that depends on whether or not we end up adopting Composer. If we're able to push Composer further, it'll be a lot easier to do that, and then we can push that as the way you really, really should be doing things. If we don't, then the added overhead of doing it that way may be too much for a lot of people. We'll see, but I would like to see that type of approach happen, because that is a much better development model, I agree. Okay, I'm being told I have to stop, so thank you all for coming. Please tip your waitress, review the session here. And if you're interested in helping out in symphonyifying Drupal, talk to me. I'll be here all week. I'll be at the Code Sprint as well. Thank you.